Welcome back to Nature's Corner. My name is Erin Shaw. I'm a naturalist on Ohio Department of Natural Resources. Today's show is about Ohio forestry. We have a special guest with us, Pat Migliozzi, who is a state forester.
Yes, I'm Pat Migliozzi. I'm a forester with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, the Division of Forestry. And I'm a state service forester. So what I do is I cover Warren, Butler, Greene, and Hamilton counties, and essentially I give landowners advice on how to best manage their forest.
So that's what a forester does. You work with private landowners.
Yes, so we have private foresters that work with private landowners, and there's also foresters we have on our state forests that help manage our state forest lands. But me, primarily working with private landowners, because the majority of Ohio's forests, roughly 87%, is privately owned. So it's really important to get landowners that advice from a professional forester on how to best manage their forest.
So how do they get information? They come to you, you put on programs?
There's a lot of different ways. One is they can go to our website, the Ohio Division of Forestry, and there's a link there for landowner assistance, and they can contact us, or might be working with the Soil and Water Conservation District or Ohio State University Extension Office, and they might refer them to a forester if they have a forest or wanting to know how to best manage their forest.
Okay. So, say I have a couple trees in my yard, it's not really what do you consider a forest?
A forest, usually a couple acres of woods or more, typically.
Okay.
Yeah.
And does that count for maybe I have a brand new piece of land with no trees at all?
So if you had a brand new piece of land without any trees, then yeah, we would be able to assist you in, if you wanted to have a forest, in developing a plan to help you determine what trees you want to plant. First, we'd have to look to see what soils are there, because the soils are going to dictate what type of trees would best grow there. So if you have really poorly drained soils, we wouldn't want to plant trees like white oak and red oak or walnut that like the more well-drained soils.
Sure, okay. So someone would go to the website, what did you say it was, Ohio Division of Forestry?
Ohio Division of Forestry, yeah.
Okay, and they would get your contact info or someone and is the consultation, does it cost?
No, it's a free service. Your tax dollars pay for it. So you go right to our website, and there's a county map or statewide map of the different counties, and you can look to see what forester covers your county and give them a call or shoot them an email.
All right, so tell us a little bit about Ohio's history with forestry.
So Ohio, prior to settlement, was about 95% forest land. In the western portions of the state where we are, it was mainly comprised of beech, maple, ash, elm, some oak and hickory, walnut. In the eastern portions and southeastern portions, it was mainly your upland species like oak hickory. And a lot of that had to do with the glaciers. Western Ohio was glaciated, and eastern and southeastern Ohio was unglaciated. So there's a lot more terrain in those areas. Dictated that those better draining soils you'll have those species, those oak and hickory species. Whereas in here, better quality soils, higher quality soils. So that's why we have the beech and maple. They like better nutrient-rich soils, as well as makes prime farming ground. So prior to settlement, like I said, it was 95% forested, and then from settlement to probably the early 1900s, it was cleared down to about 12% forest land. And right now, since then, it's come up to about 31% forest cover, tree cover, which comprises about 8.5 million acres. And of that 8.5 million acres, about 87% of that is privately owned. And the vast majority of it is in the southern and southeastern areas of the state. Again, that's because it's unglaciated and it's not prime farm ground.
Okay. So my grandpa would tell me a story. Back in the day, a squirrel could travel from one end of the state to the other without touching the ground.
That's what they say, yeah. But our forests have been managed for a while. The Native Americans actually managed our forests with fire, and some of our species like oak and hickory are evolved in a fire-prone ecosystem. And there's always been different stages of succession throughout our history of the forest, because you can have a tornado go through, or a windstorm, or a down microburst from a thunderstorm, or maybe a massive flood, and that would change the tree composition of that forest. It might open a big canopy gap and start that succession from your grasslands, shrub layer, into smaller trees, into more mature trees.
Okay, so the succession is a natural...
It's a natural process.
Yeah.
And so when foresters are giving advice to landowners on how to manage their forest, we use what's called silviculture. Silviculture is the art and science of growing trees, and a lot of our management practices, like timber harvesting, we try to mimic those natural disturbances. So if a landowner wants to grow trees that are more intolerant to shade, like oak, hickory, tulip poplar, black cherry, walnut, we're going to need to try and mimic the natural disturbances that would create that type of environment. So if it was an oak and hickory forest, it may have been a fire that would go through, and that would open up a big canopy gap and allow for those oak and hickory seedlings to regenerate. If it was, say, tulip poplar, cherry, it may have been a wind event that would have opened up that canopy to allow those to grow. If they wanted to promote more of your shade-tolerant species like beech and sugar maple and basswood, then we would need those smaller canopy gaps where you would just take out individual trees here and there, and that's going to simulate basically that tree dying of old age or insects and disease.
Okay. So, might be a weird question, but how would someone choose what trees they want on their property? I mean, other than the soil type,
right.
I guess if they're going to harvest the timber or...
So a lot of it would be whatever the landowner's goals are. If they want to manage for attracting wildlife, then so we know that we want to manage for those trees that are going to promote wildlife and attract wildlife, like oak and hickory. Hickory is a great tree for wildlife because it's got obviously the hickory nut, good, what we call a hard mast, and then the shagbark hickory, the bark flakes, the folds, how it flakes off. It's great habitat for things like bat species, like your federally endangered Indiana bat. And then your oak trees are great just for that, again, that hard mass, that acorn. And I think somewhere around 500 different types of insects, their life cycle's tied to an oak tree. Or if the landowner wanted to, was real big into making maple syrup, then we would promote those maple trees, and we would do anything to create those smaller canopy disturbances to get maple to regenerate in there. So a lot of it's going to dictate on what that landowner's goals are. Now, if that landowner decides that they want to create those canopy gaps to get, say, oak and hickory regenerating, then they would contact a forester, and then that forester would then assist in determining which trees to cut. And you can either just cut those trees, leave them dead standing, or if they're merchantable, you can sell them through a timber harvest. And we highly recommend that if landowners are going to go that route, that they work with a private consulting forester. Private consulting foresters, they can provide that landowner with a management plan, how to best manage their forest, kind of like an instruction manual. And then they can help choose which trees to sell, and then they can help bid those trees out to a timber buyer, and then they can help choose that timber buyer and then write up a contract with that timber buyer and make sure that that timber buyer is following along with that contract during that sale.
That's a great resource.
Yeah, and so they can contact the Division of Forestry, or there's a great website called Before You Cut, and they can get information there on finding a state service forester or a private consulting forester.
Okay. So you said call before you cut. Is it, I know the Indiana bat is an endangered species. And in the state park, we're not allowed to cut trees after April 1st.
Yeah.
Unless it's in a danger spot.
On private grounds, you'd want to check with the Federal Fish and Wildlife Services for those regulations. The Division of Forestry, we're not a non-regulatory agency, but we definitely want, when we're harvesting on state land, we leave all of our shagbark, our loose bark hickories, or any other trees that have a real shaggy bark to it for that purpose, for the Indiana bat. So
bats are a concern right now because of the white nose syndrome, and I think people are starting to realize how important bats are, you know, because they eat all the insects.
Oh yeah.
And it's way better than an insecticide poison spray that you put out there. And a lot of people are putting bat boxes, you know, and asking me all kinds of questions about bats. But it's interesting that you can plant a tree in your yard that will have all kinds of benefits, plus a bat habitat. So the shagbark hickory.
The shagbark hickory is a great one.
They go up underneath the...
Right underneath the bark folds there.
Yeah.
White oaks, when they're more mature, underneath their branches, they'll have those same kind of bark folds. Another thing the landowner can do in a forest is if they want to manage, attract wildlife, and they've got, say, an oak tree that's competing with an elm tree, they can actually girdle that elm tree to kill it on the stump, and that'll allow the oak tree to expand its canopy where the elm tree was. So take in more sun, the more food it can make, the more acorns it'll be able to make. But then that elm tree, now that's girdled and dead standing, that bark will start to flake off, and then the bats can roost right underneath that bark.
Interesting. And that's so much better than a cave or a big enclosed area, because that's how the white nose syndrome spreads.
Exactly.
And in a tree, they're more like
Isolated.
Isolated, yeah. Very good. So tell us about the future of Ohio forestry.
We're starting to use, on state lands, use fire as a management tool. We're using different types of harvesting techniques to promote, again, more regeneration in oak and hickory because of all the wildlife benefits associated with them. And our forests are getting healthier because we're managing them. We've got black bears now residing in Ohio. We've got bald eagles making nests. Bobcats are making a big comeback. So our managed forests are getting healthier, but it's the unmanaged forests that we really need to focus on because we've got threats like invasive species, whether that's plant species like bush honeysuckle or ailanthus, which is tree of heaven is a common name for it, or multiflora rose. Or it could be insect species like the emerald ash borer or Asian longhorn beetle, things like that.
Yeah, so if you don't treat the woods or if you don't manage them, then it actually creates more problems amongst the whole state.
Yeah, exactly. So if bush honeysuckle, it usually starts on the edge of the woods and eventually will start to creep into the woods. And if you have, a lot of people in southwest Ohio are struggling with this problem where the overstory was dominated by ash trees, and now those ash trees are dying from the emerald ash borer, and bush honeysuckle moved into that understory, and that bush honeysuckle will prevent any new trees from regenerating. There's also showing studies that bush honeysuckle in that understory will greatly impact the growth of those trees that are already growing there. It can reduce their growth, and then it can also prevent a lot of things like your wildflowers from regenerating, from growing underneath. So I've had landowners that have went through and controlled the bush honeysuckle and have kept it in check. That's the biggest thing, is it's not a one and done deal, but you always have to keep up with it. And the regeneration of new tree seedlings coming up and the wildflowers that are there, it's just fantastic.
So how do you control honeysuckle?
Honeysuckle is one where it stays green into, it leaves out early and then it drops its leaves later. So the best time is in the fall, late October, early November, so it's actively growing, but our native vegetation is dormant or going dormant. The leaves have changed color, but the honeysuckle is to be nice and green. So you can treat it with a foliar treatment of a herbicide. Unfortunately, you have to use a herbicide, but you can treat it with a foliar treatment, so that's spraying the leaves, and it'll kill the honeysuckle but won't harm the native vegetation because the native vegetation is dormant. The other method is on honeysuckle that's much bigger in diameter. You can cut it and then treat right on that cut surface. So you're really going to minimize the amount of herbicide you're going to use because you're really focusing on just where that cut stump is. And both those treatments work real well, or a mixture of those.
Okay. And I've seen the method before where you cut the honeysuckle stump and then use like a dauber or something.
like a bingo ink dauber.
Yeah.
You can put your herbicide right in there, cut it, and then daub that right on that cut surface. I've also seen people use just squirt bottles. My biggest recommendation is, use the correct herbicide, follow the label, and then if it doesn't have a dye in it, put in some blue food coloring, so at least for that day you can see what you treated. And a good resource to find where you can, what chemicals work and what best treatments are, you can go to Ohio Woodland Stewards. They have a lot of really good fact sheets, and most of the fact sheets I give to landowners, that's where it comes from, right, the Ohio Woodland Stewards.
Huh, interesting. So right here where we're standing is actually a very good example of how honeysuckle can take over, because on this side of the trail there was a house there and they cleared the house, and we did not manage this area properly, obviously, and it looks very different from this side of the trail, which has not been disturbed in a long time, and it's much more clear. It's a night and day difference right here.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Over here you can clearly see all the honeysuckle. It's bright green right now. There's a little bit of forsythia in here too.
And it's so thick I can't even see through it.
Exactly.
It's just
I've seen this stuff get so thick that the deer won't even move through it. With honeysuckle, deer won't really browse on it because it's very low nutritional value, So it puts more browse pressure on the native vegetation that's there. It's got a flower that's not very good for pollinators. It has a berry that very poor nutritional value for wildlife again, and it grows so thick and dense in these areas that again nothing can regenerate underneath.
Yeah.
So yeah, this area was cleared, and then what came in first was the honeysuckle, and then we have these nice tulip poplars too, and these are trees that are intolerant to shade. So there was that opening, and they have a wind-blown seed, so they blew in and started to grow, and then this honeysuckle invaded as well.
So the ash tree is devastating. That's a tragedy.
Yeah, the emerald ash borer, yeah.
Yeah. So what do you recommend as the next step?
So with that, I've had some landowners that were, again, the overstory is mainly ash, maybe some elm that's dying due to Dutch elm disease, and the understory is that bush honeysuckle. What I'm telling them to do is, one, control that bush honeysuckle or any of the invasive species in that understory. That's the first step you have to take. And then, if you don't have any desirable tree species around that you want to grow, then you might need to go through and actually do a tree planting underneath. If the majority of that canopy is going to be gone, then you're going to want to use things like, again, oak, hickory, potentially walnut. A lot of it's, again, going to depend on the soils, but it's a good turning point for that forest where that landowner can then manage it for how they want and make it to what they want it to be in the future.
That's great. So I think planting trees is a whole nother show.
Oh yeah, definitely. There's whether it's a seedling or a balled and burlap tree, there's a lot of different things to do.
But it's important because I see a lot of people, the trees are expensive and they're laborious. You have to go and dig a hole,
take off the burlap, put that tree in there, yeah. And that's a definitely different process. As a service forester, usually we're dealing with people who have maybe a 10-acre cornfield that they want to put into a forest now. So then we're recommending buying little tree seedlings, and you plant them on maybe a 10 by 10 spacing, which is roughly about 436 trees per acre. So you get those trees in the ground. Oftentimes we recommend putting a tree planting tube or a tree shelter over it, and that'll protect that seedling from deer and rabbit browse, and it'll also give that tree a little bit of competition to grow up out of that tube.
And you don't want to pile up your mulch 4 feet high.
Yeah, if you're doing a balled and burlap in your yard, yeah, you definitely don't want to do that volcano mulching or anything like that.
So if someone what's the best time to plant trees?
Well, if it's going to be your balled and burlap, a lot of times fall is a good time to plant. If it's going to be a seedling, a 1-year-old tree to start a new forest, then we recommend in the spring, as early on as you can, but ideally after a frost.
Okay.
So late March in our area is usually a great time to start.
All right. So we'll have a whole nother show on that. That's quite a process. But I see that you brought some tools, and this deals with cutting trees down. So when you're managing forests, you're planting trees and you're also harvesting trees.
So in Ohio, you don't necessarily need to, if you're going to do a timber harvest, you don't necessarily need to replant because we have a lot of good natural regeneration. Bearing in mind, again, you're keeping the invasive species under control. We go through, we look at the trees. Again, we use silviculture, the art and science of growing trees, mimicking those natural disturbances we mentioned earlier. And some of the tools we use is like a Biltmore stick, and that's a tool where you can measure the diameter of the tree and the height of the tree, determine the amount of volume in that tree. And an interesting side fact about the Biltmore stick is it was developed at the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina, where one of the first forestry schools in the U.S. started.
Really? Okay, let's see what you got here.
So the Biltmore stick, how a forester uses it is we line one end up on the edge of the tree, and then we look this end up this edge, and then we see where the other edge of the tree is. And where I'm looking right now, I'm getting 16 inches in diameter. And all foresters measure trees at DBH, which is diameter at breast height, which is 4.5 feet above the ground on the uphill side of the tree. So I can see this tree is 16 inches in diameter, and my rough estimation is there's about 2 logs in this tree, one log being 16 feet, and I can use this stick then. It tells me that there's 16 inches in diameter, and 2 logs would be 150 board feet in that tree. And when a consulting forester is marking trees, what they would do is oftentimes put a slash on one side of the tree and then on the other side of the tree, and then they might put a dot on the stump, or they will put a dot on the stump. And they would be able to tally up all the trees and determine the amount of merchantable volume that's there. So there might be 28 black walnut, average diameter, 23 or 24 inches in diameter, and maybe X thousand number of board feet. And then that's what they would use to send out to the different timber buyers to solicit bids.
So I suppose there's quite a lot of tools and resources that you use as a forester. If someone is interested in that career, where would they start?
One, contact a forester, see where they went to school and what resources, how they got into forestry. Myself, I went to Ohio State, got a Bachelor's of Science degree in forestry. It was a 4-year degree. We took classes in dendrology, which is tree identification. We took classes in silviculture. We took classes in biometrics, which is measuring trees essentially. We also took classes in wildlife management, soils, a lot of different things. So you can go a 4-year degree at Ohio State, Hocking Technical College. They have a 2-year degree. A lot of times students will get their 2-year degree at Hocking and then get a 4-year degree at Ohio State.
That's a really neat job.
I love it.
And one of the tools that you use, of course, is a tree identification book.
Yeah, tree ID. Yeah. When I went to school, our tree dendrology final was in December. So trees don't have leaves on at that point. So a lot of times people can look and see a maple leaf and know that it's a maple. But foresters, yeah, we have to look at the bark of the tree, the buds of the tree, how they're arranged. A lot of different things can tell us about what that tree is. So a field guide like Eastern Trees, a lot of times they'll have what we call a dichotomous key. So for example, maples have their branches and their buds are arranged oppositely from one another, whereas something like beech, they're arranged alternately from one another. So a key in a field guide will ask you, okay, is it a deciduous tree? So does it have leaves, is it a hardwood, or is it a coniferous tree, a pine tree? Okay, so if it's a deciduous tree, okay, then it'll ask you, is it opposite or alternate? Okay, it's opposite. We'll say it's opposite. It'll ask you some more questions. Is it a simple leaf or a compound leaf? So a simple leaf would just be like your maple leaf. A compound leaf would be something like a buckeye leaf, where you have a whole bunch of little leaflets that make up that leaf. And then, so maybe it is a compound leaf. Is it palmately compound, like a palm for buckeye, or is it a pinnately compound, which would be something like ash? So basically these keys really help you narrow down what that species might be.
Is an ash leaf? It's a stem with little...
Yeah, basically a stem we call a petiole, and then it has a whole bunch of leaflets, and that whole thing makes up the leaf.
One leaf.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in the fall, that whole thing falls off. And one acronym I teach my landowners is MADBUCK, M for maple, A for ash, D for dogwood, and buck for buckeye. All those are tree species that have that opposite branching pattern. And then box elder, which is technically a maple, also has a compound leaf like ash. So there's a lot of different tools we use.
Yeah, so let's look at this one, for example, right here. This is opposite, right?
The seedling? So this is actually alternate.
Alternate, that's what I meant to say, alternate.
So you can see the branches alternate from side to side. So if it was opposite, you would have another branch coming off directly right here. You would have another branch here. I would also look at the buds, because sometimes you can have there could have been a branch and it may have fallen off. So I'll look at the buds and I can see that the buds are arranged alternately from one another. So, if it was all opposite, you'd have another bud direct coming out right here on the opposite side of this bud.
So is it true in the wintertime you can identify the tree just by, there's all these buds, just by this much of it? Yes.
Yeah, some trees like bitternut hickory, for example, the bud is a sulfuric yellow color, so that makes it really easy to identify. Pawpaw is another plant, one of my favorites with the pawpaw fruit in September. The bud on that is kind of like a black velvety color, so that makes it pretty easy to identify, and it has that alternate branching as well.
So what is this one?
So this is, judging by the buds, and it's alternate, and the leaves are just coming out, and I could feel they're kind of fuzzy. So this is going to be an elm tree. Okay. It's too early for me to tell whether it's a American elm or a slippery elm. Actually, judging by the bud size, I would say that this is an American elm. Slippery elms, the buds are usually a lot bigger.
Okay. And what else do we see around here?
We see a lot of great trees. We got a dogwood here, a flowering dogwood.
Oh, show me the dogwood.
Yeah. And right over here is our dogwood.
Okay.
And it's got that real characteristic bark that's almost like scales or an alligator skin. You know, it's a really great tree. This is a tree that's just kind of in this mid-story, creates good vertical habitat for wildlife, has a really nice white flower, produces berries, again, great for wildlife. And then, right here, this is another great tree. So the dogwood again has that opposite branching pattern, and then this is a American beech. This has that alternate branching pattern. And this is a neat one because I show this to kids and they oftentimes think that this tree has thorns all over it because of these right here. But these are actually the buds for the leaves. They're going to leaf out this year, and they do. They look just like thorns.
They look like swords to me.
Oh, swords? Yeah, I can see that. And these are real easy to find in the woods because they have that gray, smooth bark, almost like the leg of an elephant. And then in the winter, they oftentimes keep their leaves. They'll be a more golden color, and then they'll eventually start to fall off when they get these buds on them. And then these will open up being next year's leaves.
Cool. So you can, in the middle of winter, you know, I like to take walks,
Mm-hmm.
and you can look around and see the leaves that are still hanging on,
Mm-hmm.
and one of them will be a beech.
Beech, yeah, really nice. Great great tree for in the winter for that foliage.
Yeah.
And another one of those trees is very shade tolerant. It doesn't like a lot of sunlight, so they're going to sit here in this understory waiting for a disturbance like a bigger tree to die out due to insects and disease or old age.
So the beech are native, and they're actually really important for wildlife. So there's a mature beech over
right
here.
over there,
Actually,
yeah.
it might be past mature.
Yeah, a little bit past mature, yeah, that's for sure.
But it's still important, and important not to cut down. So
Exactly.
let's go take a look at that
let's
one.
take a look. Right here, yeah, this is that really neat beech. Definitely way past its prime. It's died. Again, this is going to be one of those small canopy gaps where the beech and sugar maple are going to be able to regenerate in. And I oftentimes have landowners that will have a tree similar to this that's, again, it's dead, but it's got these big cavities in it, and they want to cut it down. I tell them, don't. It's great wildlife habitat. A lot of your cavity nesting wildlife species like owls and flying squirrels and bats utilize trees like this.
And I thought I saw a honeybee coming and going.
That probably,
there.
yeah. Honeybees oftentimes will utilize trees like this as well, and we know they're extremely important honeybees as because their populations are declining.
Yeah.
So having trees like this, places where they can nest, as well as promoting trees that they can use to pollinate or to get their nectar from.
So standing dead trees are an important part of the forest, and
They are.
also
This down material is also extremely important. As it slowly decays, it's going to be a nice slow release fertilizer for that forest. So if a landowner, oftentimes if they're doing a timber harvest, they're wanting people to come and take those tops out. Oftentimes say, leave it. It's great for the forest. Again, slow release fertilizer. And then it's almost a highway for a lot of your smaller wildlife mammal species like chipmunks and squirrels and mice. And then also as they're slowly decaying, they oftentimes retain a lot of moisture, and you'll find a lot of your mole salamander species, your ambistomas, underneath logs like this, whether they're during the breeding season or in late summer when there's not much moisture around because we haven't had much rain. These will still have a lot of moisture, and they'll kind of seek refuge there.
That's great. And we have a lot of people that come here camping, and they want to go collect all the downed wood, and no, it's important.
It is, yeah, extremely important for,
Yeah.
again, the nutrients getting back into the soil as well as wildlife. These standing dead trees are what we call snags, or this down material we call coarse woody debris.
Okay. So I want to see one more tree.
Okay.
Before we close the show. We were talking earlier about the shagbark or
Okay.
the loose bark hickory.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, let's go over.
Okay.
So here's our shagbark hickory. Great tree, and this is that what we call exfoliating bark that we were talking about earlier. So a lot of your smaller forest bat species can roost right underneath these bark folds. So it's an important tree for wildlife, just bats again, as well as the hard mast that this tree produces, a good food source for your wildlife species.
And it has the nuts that come off. What kind of animals eat that?
Some deer, squirrels are going to love it. They're going to, chow down on that. Raccoons, they'd eat it as well. Yeah.
So it's a very easy tree to identify.
Oh yeah, it's one of the first. I sometimes have landowners that they don't know their tree species, but they know shagbark hickory because it's pretty shaggy.
Which is quite opposite of the beech tree we just saw.
Exactly, with that real smooth bark. So those are some of those characteristics that foresters use when the trees don't have leaves on to determine what species they are, whether it's the exfoliating bark on the shagbark hickory, that real smooth gray bark on the American beech, or maybe that blocky bark on the dogwood.
Yeah. Well, Pat, thank you so much. I've really learned a lot today, and I've learned a lot about managing Ohio forests and why it's important. So if someone, remind me again where someone could go to find out more information.
So find out more information, they can go to the Ohio Division of Forestry's webpage. Great resource there on not only our state forests, but as well as the service foresters, the state service foresters, as well as they can go to Call Before You Cut if they're thinking about doing a timber harvest. Ohio Woodland Stewards, that's a great resource for fact sheets on a lot of different management options. And then even the Ohio chapter of the Society of American Foresters is a good resource as well, and they can go there to find a private consulting forester.
Thank you so much, because it's interesting to think that my little patch of woods can really affect my neighbors and maybe throughout the state.
Oh, definitely, yeah. So thank you for having me on. This was a great time. I always enjoy being in the woods.
Yes, well, and that's it for today's show. Thank you for watching. If you'd like more information, you can check out the websites that Pat mentioned. You can also check us out on ohiostateparks.org, and we will see you on the trails.